Hello everyone, I'm Nathan Wildman from Tilburg University. Thank you very much for coming to my talk, which is entitled Distinctness, Contingentism, and the Being Constraint. So really just sort of trips off the tongue there. My talk is basically about a debate that's going on in modal metaphysics and modal logic between necessitists and contingentists. And we can really distill this debate down to a single principle, which we can call the first-order contingency of existence. You can express this a bunch of different ways. I've chosen to express it like this, which basically says, right, it's not the case that necessarily everything necessarily exists. Now note here, importantly, the necessity that we're using is metaphysical, or if you like, we could call it logical. It's absolute necessity. And the quantifiers here are meant to be interpreted as utterly unrestricted. So in effect, if you drop the negation, this says, hey, every possible world has every possible object in it. In contrast, if you keep the negation as one's written, it says, well, there are at least some objects that merely contingently exist. Maybe just one, maybe a whole bunch, but there's at least one. So unsurprisingly, contingentists accept, while necessitists reject one as formulated. Necessitists accept one without the negation in front. So contingentists allow for at least maybe actual, maybe merely possible things that merely contingently exist, that can exist in one possible world and not exist in another. Now this principle is one kind of cornerstone. There's a good bit of debate going on about it. There's another similar principle that doesn't really get as much airtime, and this is the first-order being constraint. Now, this is just a hot mess if you first look at it, but this is a kind of generalized version I borrowed from Williamson. The basic idea of the first-order being constraint is actually fairly simple, and it's that, look, necessarily something has to be in order to be a certain way. That is, if an object satisfies some kind of predication or property or relational description, then it has to exist. So this principle, I think, this first-order being constraint, has pretty strong intuitive appeal. Indeed, as Williamson puts it, right, how could a thing be property were there no such thing to be property? How could one thing be related to another were there no such things to be related? Basically, like Williamson suggests, it's not analytic, but it's really close to being it. So 1 and 2, I think most metaphysicians, or maybe even most logicians, when we think about modal objects, tend to accept them. And just for the sake of this talk, I'm going to buy the idea that 1 and 2, taken as the conjunction of 1 and 2, will kind of correspond to or constitute what we'll call standard contingentism. And I think quite a few people are standard contingentists. I'm definitely one. I kind of think that this is a good, sensible view about the metaphysics of modality. So I'm happy to buy 1 and 2. What I want to do here is basically raise some problems for standard contingentism. In particular, I'm going to raise 2 objections. The real brief version of the objections is, well, standard contingentism doesn't play nice with some really plausible principles about numerical distinctness. In fact, when we just have these principles about distinctness and we take standard contingentism, we get contradictions. And that's bad. What's even worse is I don't really think that there's an easy way to solve these problems. So that's going to be the gist of it. It's not going to be a very happy message, but sometimes we need the lumps to go with all the positives. So here's the plan. I'm going to start off by just first presenting my initial objection, which is going to involve a certain principle about the nature of numerical distinctness. I'll then very briefly talk about some possible replies, only one of which I think kind of works. It's still quite ugly. This will lead to a second objection, again having to do with a different, well, again about distinctness, but it'll be about a different principle concerning distinctness, but will again generate a contradiction. We'll consider some replies, none of which are very appealing if you want to maintain standard contingentism, and then we'll kind of wrap up by gesturing at maybe where to go from here. We should be done pretty quickly. So that's the plan. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first distinctness objection has to do with the principle I like to call distinctness is non-identity. Really, the name for it doesn't matter. We can just see it written out here. So in effect, what this tells us is, right, necessarily for any two x and y, they're distinct if and only if they're not identical. So, Catherine, who's organizing the conference, and I, we're distinct. Why are we distinct? Well, setting aside any qualitative differences, we're just not identical, and that suffices to guarantee that we're distinct. Same thing with me and Santa. Santa Claus and I are not identical, because Santa doesn't exist. Sorry, everybody. So we're distinct. I think that's pretty plausible. Now, the problem is that standard contingentism and 3 lead to inconsistencies. They're going to get contradictions out of them. The argument's actually pretty simple. So let's assume we have two objects, A and B, and A and B are both contingent, so they can exist in some worlds, they can fail to exist in others, and they're independent. That is, it's not the case that necessarily if one exists, so does the other, or vice versa. You can have A without B, you could have B without A. That's all we need. Now suppose that B exists and A doesn't in world W. I'm going to put this in terms of possible worlds because it's a little easier to formulate. We don't have to phrase it that way. We could just do it with boxes and diamonds instead. But suppose that B exists and A doesn't in world W. Now given 2, right, the first order being constraint, well, it must then be the case that they're not identical. That is, this sentence, with the negation in front, is going to be true in W. Why? Well, look, something has to be some way, even to be identical. And since A has no being in W, it doesn't exist, that identity claim's false, so the negation's true. Cool. Of course, that immediately entails, given the principle that we had in the previous slide, this principle of 3, that, well, A is distinct from B in W, because, right, the negation of their identity claim just simply entails, given the biconditional in 3, that A is distinct from B. Here's the problem. Given 2, it can't be the case that A is distinct from B in W. Because again, something must be in order to be some way, even being distinct. So this must be both false and true. Not so good. Now note, again, all we needed for this was two possible contingent independent existence. And then we can run this argument. It doesn't matter what we pick. So that's the first objection. Given 1, 2, and 3, we can readily get a contradiction. And that's not so good. So how might we reply? How might the standard contingentist, and I should say we, because I'm a standard contingentist, reply? Well, the easiest one would be to reject either 1 or 2. Give up on there being contingent entities, or give up on the first order being constraint. But this is just abandoning standard contingentism. That's the last resort. A different option might be to reject 3, right? This sort of principle about the relationship between the negation of identity statements and distinctness claims. And this is a move, but much like Williamson talking about the first order being constraint, I find 3 not analytic, but pretty close. So I need something pretty substantive to kind of motivate it. And I don't think that this puzzle alone suffices to kind of do that. I think there might be 2 other ways to go. So putting aside rejecting 3. One of them is you could deny that there are any independent entities. So allow for contingentism. You still accept 1. Right? But what we say is everything is codependent. Now what this does is it forces us to buy in basically 2 types of worlds. There are the worlds with populations, and in fact every world must have the exact same population, namely the one that's in this world. Right? Because if you have even one single object that's possibly different, then we can run the argument. So every world that has any population must have the same population. And the other type of world is an utterly empty world. That is, it's a world that has literally no entities whatsoever. Now, this is a weird kind of contingentist view. I think it'll get around the argument. It lets you accept 1 and 2 and 3. It's not great, but it's a view. We'll come back to it, though, with the second objection. A slightly different way you might go is you might adopt something like a free logic. And this is, I think, a move that lots of standard contingentists are pretty happy to go with. The problem is that free logics aren't going to help us here. So suppose we adopt a negative free logic. Well, then we're still going to generate a contradiction. So let's think about it, right? According to a negative free logic, monadic or atomic sentences featuring an empty name are going to turn out false. Cool. So A is identical to B is false, which means the negation's true, which means our distinctness claim's true, again, given 3. But of course, this is still an atomic relational claim, so it must be false. So now we've got, hey, the distinctness claim is both true and false again. That's not so good. Now, of course, you could still go and just deny 3, but that's right back into the other options, and so we're not really being helped out much by our negative free logic. Now, we might do the same thing, right? Maybe it was negative free logic. Let's go with positive free logic. It's the same problem. We're still going to be able to generate a contradiction in basically the same way. So, now of course, you could then avoid the contradiction by denying 3, but that's just to fall back on one of our other solutions. So free logic doesn't really help us here. So that's kind of bad. We have a way out by adopting this kind of like denying that there are any independent entities, but it's kind of a repulsive move. And even still, we can still make it not work. So let's move to the second objection. The second objection says, okay, cool, let's just spot you that 3 doesn't work. Right? Let's spot you, maybe we're going to deny independent entities. Let's take a new principle about distinctness. And this is, I don't have a great name for it. I think we can call it as possible distinctness entails necessary distinctness. Or in kind of modal logic terms, right, this little principle here. In words, necessarily for any x and y, if x and y are possibly distinct, then they're necessarily distinct. And this is basically just a flip to the necessity of identity. Where, right, if you buy necessity of identity, you're going to say, right, if x and y are possibly identical, then they're necessarily identical. So this is the same, just applying it to distinctness. Now the problem is, standard contingentism in 4 also lead to inconsistencies. We can generate contradictions here too. So here's the problem. Here's the second objection. Again, we're going to take 4 and 1 and 2 from earlier and generate a problem. So let's let A and B be contingent entities that both exist and they're distinct in world W. Note, they don't have to be independent. They can be dependent on each other. All that matters is that they're both contingent. So they can exist in some worlds and they can fail to exist in others. Now, because they exist and are distinct in W, they're possibly distinct, because actuality entails possibility. So then by 4, necessarily, they're distinct. So far, so good. Now, of course, go to any world where they don't exist. So let's call this one of those worlds W star. So suppose that A and B don't exist in W star. Well, by the first order being constraint, it's not the case that they're distinct, because again, you have to be in order to be some way, and A and B have no being. So this relational claim must be false. But now we have it in the world where they don't exist. So, cool. Now we have a problem, right? Because while we don't have a flat contradiction, because remember this is this is our necessity claim, and the actual distinctness is in world W, whereas they're not being distinct is in W star, this result is still going to give us negation on the conditional claim. It's not the case that possibly A and B are distinct entails, or if A and B are possibly distinct, then necessarily they're distinct, because there's a world where they're not, namely W star. So we've got a contradiction with 4 now, or at least a counterexample. So yeah, we basically can generate the exact same problem, or a variant of the same problem. What's really nice is that this objection also undermines that kind of no independent entities reply to the first objection. Because again, as I said, for this problem, they don't have to be independent. They just need to be contingent. So that's bad. Again, standard contingentism looks like it's facing a pretty big problem. So what can we do? Well, here are some possible replies to this second objection. One option is obviously to just simply abandon 1 or 2, but that's giving up on standard contingentism, and that's something that probably going to be hesitant to do. Alternatively, we might reject 4. Right? This principle that possible distinctness entails necessary distinctness. But I don't think this is a good idea, because this forces us to lose out on the idea of necessity of distinctness. And I think actually we could then use this to maybe generate contradictions if we also buy the necessity of identity. So unless you're happy to go for contingent identities and also contingent distinctnesses, this doesn't look like a good solution. We might try and do free logic again, but same problems are going to come up, right? I can still generate contradictions, or to avoid contradictions, force the standard contingentist into rejecting 4. And this doesn't matter if it's negative or positive free logic. The same kind of problems are going to play out. So the upshot is there doesn't seem to be an obvious happy way out of the puzzle for the standard contingentist. No matter what they do, they're going to run into something like this problem if we buy 1, 2, and 4. So that's basically it. Let's just kind of wrap up, think about where to go from here. So what we've done is kind of presented 2 puzzles for standard contingentism. And I think these are pretty substantive puzzles. I think there's something to be said for 1 and 2. I find them both very intuitive. I think many people do too. I think many people would also find 3 and 4 pretty intuitive. But as soon as we have combinations of 1, 2, and 3, or 1, 2, and 4, we've got a problem. And this is something the standard contingentists need to kind of go, to figure out. Also, it's worth pointing out that free logic doesn't really seem to help here. So this is an issue. These are genuine problems. Our best options, the best kind of ways out, seem to be either just giving up on standard contingentism. Maybe we go join Williamson and adopt something like necessitism, or maybe we give up on the first order being constraint, or we can play around a little bit here. Or maybe we have to reject something like 3 and 4 and really rethink how we understand distinctness and possibly, relatedly, identity. Maybe we need to adopt something like relative identity after all. These are things that would-be standard contingentists need to think about. But again, the direct immediate upshot is there just doesn't seem to be a happy way out of these puzzles. And that's kind of sad for people like me who want to be standard contingentists. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you have lots of questions. I hope you can help me out here, because again, I'm trying to figure out how I can maintain this position. This is part of a larger project where I'm thinking about contingentism and being constraints in modal logic and modal metaphysics. So please, if you've got any questions or anything, send me an email or leave a comment on the video, or come along to the Q&A session. I really look forward to talking about this with you. Thank you very much. Take care, and I hopefully will talk to you all soon. Bye.